Hello and welcome to Pragmatic Tracker. My name is Bill Andrews and I'm with you on Friday the 7th of November, where we're going to look at introducing the AAG into work with bereavement counselling and assessment services and all sorts. My contact information is bill.andrews@pragmatictracker.com. So where I would suggest we begin this process is to think of an old one of those 7 habits of Stephen Covey, the 7 habits of highly successful people, and think about beginning with the end in mind. So this exercise would be literally where you spend a little bit of time to think about, well, what is success going to look like? So for example, from the point of view of the researcher, what data is going to come through into that Excel spreadsheet that can be imported into SPSS for data analysis? And if we can get a clear picture of exactly what that looks like, then we can simply back into it to figure out, well, what has to be picked up where. Now, of course, the needs of different individuals, different services, different organizations will vary immensely. And so it's a matter of being able to meet the needs of those individual practitioners and organizations on the one hand, and also to meet the needs of the researchers on the other hand. So we truly do get a representation of that idea of the research practitioner in mind. So it's perhaps worth taking just a few moments now to think about, in 2 years' time, what a successful project will look like. And once we have that done, it'll be much easier then to get us off to a good start in thinking about how do we structure things in the first place to have the best chance of achieving that success. Okay, so having paused and taken a little bit of time to do that now, let's have a look at how Pragmatic Tracker may be able to assist in this process. So the first thing I want to introduce you to here is the idea of the different structure levels within Pragmatic Tracker. So obviously, as software administrators, we can see everything that gets created within Pragmatic Tracker, everything that's set up by necessity. The administrators of any software are able to do that. Now, within a given organization, if somebody is given super user permissions, they are able to see everything within that organization. So in any one particular installation or instance of Pragmatic Tracker, if somebody has super user access, they will see everything in that particular instance or installation. Now, underneath that, one can have managerial access. So a manager sees all of the practitioners underneath them, if you like, in their own practice. A manager can also be a practitioner that treats clients, but that manager would have access to the data of any practitioners within the service that the manager is actually managing. An individual practitioner then, when is set up in Pragmatic Tracker, sees just their own caseload. So they're not privy to anybody else's caseload, they just see their own clients. The manager sees their clients in that practice, and a super user would see all of the clients and all of the managers and all of the users, practitioners in all of the practices within the installation. Now, there is a variety of factors that would influence structure choice. So let's just have a look at some of these. So the first question I suppose to ask is, are these data going to be visible to anyone at all in particular? In other words, who would be at that super user level of access per installation? Or in fact, is it only going to be the case that the data will be gathered, we as administrators would anonymize the data before distributing it for analysis to the researchers? So that's something to be taken into consideration. Now, if it's not to be visible to anyone, then who exactly is it to be visible with? And how will the data be contributed? So as I was saying, this can be done anonymously through us, or it may be the case that in particular services and organizations, the data will be visible to those services, but there will be anonymous contribution of the data going forward from there into the research entity, whatever that may be. And of course, will there be organizations with managers who need to see all data in their service or organization? Just this point I was making. So looking at this then in a pictorial representation, you could imagine, for example, that the individual practitioners are simply set up by us as administrators of the system. Each individual practitioner cannot see the data relating to any other practitioner, and we would have the responsibility of gathering that data, anonymizing it so no practitioner can be identified, and contributing the data then to the central research entity. So that might be one model. And of course, what's important to know is that bereavement services, organizations, whatever they may be, may choose to have more than one instance of Pragmatic Tracker as well, more than one installation to meet the varying requirements. Another model then might be where we as administrators set up a super user who has access to individual practitioners' data. Those practitioners might work in different organizations, but the one super user would have access to their individual data. And another model again would be where we set up both super user or super users and managers. So the managers might be in charge of particular practices, organizations, services, etc., and would be privy to the data within their organization. But the service user, the central body, if you like, in charge of gathering all the data, may be able to see the data coming in from the different services or organizations, and we of course are always there in the background as the original initiators, instigators of setting everybody up within the system. So it's a question of the degree of transparency and visibility, whether in fact it's just anonymized data is contributed to the central body, but at an individual organization level the particular managers within those organizations see the data from the individual practitioners beneath them. And a fourth model of this, of course, would be where you do have managers within particular practices or organizations, but the data is just anonymously donated into the research entity, and in which case there is no super user access beyond us being the port of first and last call, if you like, as administrators. So that's important to give some consideration to, as an organization is going to come on board, what information is going to be shared, by whom, with whom, etc. So moving on now to sort of look under the hood, if you like, of Pragmatic Tracker, we need to think about a few things. So the first thing that happens in Pragmatic Tracker is setting up a user profile. So a user is somebody, either a super user, a manager, or a practitioner, and Pragmatic Tracker can profile that user. And we have some default standard ways of doing that. So we have, for example, a user would belong to a particular practice, or again, when I say practice, this can be organization, service, whatever. And then any other user demographics that might be required, for example, age, training, years in practice, etc. And we have some standard fields already there which we found very useful, but we also have spare fields if there's anything in particular that might be required. Then moving on to thinking about client profiles. Well, the client profile then is how one will gather particular demographic contextual data about the individual client. And so when a client is first set up in the system, the demographics are captured at that point. And of course, there may be some bereavement-specific demographics that one would want to capture. For example, the time since the loss, the distance away from the loss, the last contact, etc. But then there might be other typical demographics, for example, age, gender, medication, relationship status, etc. So then moving on to thinking about the client journey through the service or the organization. Now, it could well be the case that what is required from Pragmatic Tracker, certainly initially, is kept at a very, very simple level. And we will, of course, discuss that in more detail over time. But it's important to know what the entire scope of Pragmatic Tracker is on this client journey so that one realizes the potential of the system, if you like. So this begins then with the first point of contact. Now, depending on the service or organization, this could well be a very, very simple screening. This doesn't involve any particular measurement or anything like that, but it's just simply a screening process on the telephone and deciding where to point the person who's accessing the service from there. And we have the ability to build any sort of a screening form that would be required for that sort of telephone triage as needed. Then the next obvious part of that journey for the client would be to an assessment process. And within the assessment process, we can have whatever assessment forms might be required, and then the client would move on from there into a treatment process, and of course eventually completion, and finally follow-up. So at the screening level, one might have a particular instrument, and this is typically the sort of thing that's done by telephone, deciding what's going to happen next. But then the assessment stage, which may in fact be the only stage that might be required initially, well, with assessments, we can build whatever sort of assessment form might be required by a particular service or organization, and indeed they can be different depending on the different organizations. And it's just used by the assessing practitioner. It's not a form that's filled in by the client. The client, of course, has the measures available like the AAG and any other measures that may be required at any point, or maybe added in at a later point, or maybe specific to particular research projects or whatever that might be. And then, of course, following assessment, there might be signposting to where the client is going to go next. Now, if the client goes on that treatment journey, then there will be treatment measures. Perhaps the AAG is the only measure that might be used, or there may be other sessional measures. There may be measures that are just used at the first and the final appointment, and of course there might be feedback measures that are used session by session or at the end of treatment or whatever. And then at the completion session, there may be the same measures, or there may be some additional instrument that's used only at assessment and completion. All of these possibilities are there, and the purpose of this is simply to make you aware of all of those possibilities, really, because we have tried to build Pragmatic Tracker in such a way to make it as flexible as possible. Now, follow-up, we believe, is very important and is the area that's often so much missing out of research. And so we have the ability to send any measures onto the client via email link or whatever, or telephone, and transfer the information from paper, however that might be decided to be done. And then, of course, finally, we get to the data reporting. So we began with the end in mind, but here is the end of that journey, if you like, the output of the whole effort. And as we said, we needed to start it with that end in mind, because really, if all of this is going to be very valuable from a research point of view, this is where the data is going to be critically important. Of course, we would say, and we would very strongly emphasize, that there are many myriads of benefits to working in an outcome-informed way, working with feedback that will actually help very much in the process of treatment as well. But at this stage, we're looking at the sort of data that will be pulled out of Pragmatic Tracker for data analysis. Now, again, the important thing is to decide, well, what's the minimum required? What is the very least amount of information we definitely want to have? Because, of course, that's very helpful in deciding, well, how do we implement this in order to do our level best to capture that data? And above all, Above all, I would like to emphasize to be realistic. The failures come when we are simply overzealous, overambitious, looking for the heavens and finding it difficult to settle for the reality of what's actually achievable. So, above all, I think setting realistic goals, expectations, and targets is vital. And we build reports to requirements. So we have standard reporting that pulls out into what's called a CSV file, which will drop into Excel and then can be exported into SPSS. We have a standard report that pulls out all of the standard information, if you like, that's captured by client, which basically is total scores for any measures that are used, etc. Now, we will build, of course, customized reports that drop into Excel to pull out those exact fields that can then be popped into SPSS because after many years of dealing with lots of data, I know how incredibly frustrating it is if the data doesn't drop in the right way and one wastes eons of time trying to sort it all out. So that's very, very much in our mind, and we're very keen to help people to be able to do that. So in terms of management of projects like this, well, once again, I would emphasize the idea of being realistic and managing expectations. It's very easy to get carried away and become very lofty in one's aspirations and simply lose touch with reality. And the reality is that the implementation of projects like this requires very careful planning. It requires a lot of commitment and organization, but it requires keeping things, I think, as simple as possible in order to optimize the chance of success. And we can help a lot with that. And then I've got here to reduce the expectations by 50%, simply to keep our feet on the ground and be realistic in what we think we can achieve. And of course, part of that then is starting very small. So ideally starting with one small project and getting people on board with that. A small group, it doesn't matter how small it is, half a dozen people, 10 people, a dozen people, and with one key person in charge. And this is this next point. In each project, identify a key individual with overall responsibility for that project. Now, that person can be the person that liaises with us, for example, but it's going to be critically important that there is that person. This is what we've found over and over again. It's really important that one person is accountable and that one person can be the port of call for the others in that particular team or project to bring any questions or issues to, which of course can then be relayed back to us for us to answer. But we have gone to great lengths to try to ensure that Pragmatic Tracker is as self-supporting as possible, with lots and lots of help information within the actual program itself in case anybody gets stuck. And then my final point here is to liaise with us for support, for any support that's required. We have a lot of experience in this area and we're only too happy to help and be part of whatever process to whatever degree is required. It may be the case that in early stages more support is required until things get on their way, but then of course as people become more and more experienced, then our role can slip into the background and these projects become self-supporting themselves. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this short, under 20-minute presentation. I hope you found it reasonably interesting and I hope it helps to inspire you to think about the various issues that are involved and that we will have plenty of time to discuss these. So thank you very much for your time.